Russia's investments reveal a great deal about what the Kremlin is able to do, and, critically, what it is unable to do. We just need to know where to look, which, happily for us, is right here. You have seen the seemingly non-stop headlines at this point. Russian drones set new records over Ukrainian skies. And those headlines will continue for the foreseeable future, because Russia keeps ramping up drone production. Heck, the only reason you may eventually stop seeing those headlines is because the situation becomes so commonplace that it no longer qualifies as news. Now, to be clear, this is not going to be a video where I explain why Russia attacking civilians and civilian infrastructure is good for Ukraine in an aggregate sense. It is not. Nor is this going to be a video about how the Trump administration terminating shipments of defensive systems to Ukraine does not matter. It does. Nor is this going to be a video about the irrelevance of the Trump administration subsequently partnering with NATO to backfill any defensive weapons sent to Ukraine. That is relevant. But the thing about drone attacks is that they are very visible, unlike decisions that are very much subject to the fog of war. And that helps us draw valuable inferences about what we cannot observe. Namely, that Russia continues to have problems with recruitment and pressure along the front lines over in the east. The context of this, of course, is the roller coaster ride known as U.S. aid decisions. The saga began with the news that the United States was halting some shipments of Patriot and Stinger missiles at the start of July, citing low American stockpiles. These are air interceptor systems, the Patriot being a more serious piece of machinery, while Stingers are smaller, shoulder-fired missiles that only need a team of 1 or 2 to operate. There is an entirely separate discussion about what exactly was happening there, with the White House walking back what the Department of Defense had previously announced. We will circle back to this later, but I covered most of the logic there a couple of days ago when news broke about the deal between the United States and Europe to keep transfers going. Now, I think it is worth underscoring the importance of that agreement for Ukraine, because it means that Kyiv will have continued access to American weapons. But, at the end of the day, it is ultimately Europe purchasing the weapons, meaning that Biden-era donations are no longer on the table. Thus, Ukraine is still likely seeing some reductions in aid from the United States, more or less consistent with months-long expectations. The deal just ensures that there will not be a collapse of standard NATO procurement options. As for the ramifications here, the central lesson from this video also speaks to the aid cut situation, namely that it is bad, but also not the end of the world for Kyiv. However, what you heard about this controversy likely depended on where you heard the story from. Left-leaning outlets emphasize the negative consequences for the defense of Ukraine. Meantime, right-leaning outlets highlighted the Trump administration's argument that the United States needs to conserve its stockpiles for other conflicts around the globe, while simultaneously acknowledging the hardships that it places on Kyiv. And you may have missed how Germany telegraphed a week in advance its decision to buy Patriots from the United States to then send to Ukraine, which received substantially less coverage. But that's where today's sponsor, Ground News, comes into play. Not only does Ground News provide a quick bias comparison of big stories, it also allows you to customize your feed to focus on the topics that you care about the most. And by going to ground.news/linesonmaps or scanning the QR code on your screen, you can get 40% off a Vantage plan to cover all of your needs. So thanks again to Ground News for their continuing support of this channel. We need to begin our main discussion with some basic points about coercive bargaining. The goal for Russia right now is to convince Ukraine to cede as much territory as possible, formally or tacitly. In negotiations, 2 elements form Ukraine's bottom line. First is its expected outcome of a war if fought to a complete conclusion, hypothetically drawn here. Second is how much it expects to pay in costs through that process, represented in terms of square kilometers between the yellow and white lines. Thus, the yellow line is the most that Ukraine would give up before finding completed war to be the more attractive option. Consequently, Russia's war plan intends to push that yellow line as westward as possible. Broadly speaking, there are two ways to do this. The obvious one is to impose expectations of greater costs for continued war, which directly inflates the cost factor. More subtly, Russia can also focus on improving its expected outcome of the war, because the yellow line is drawn a certain distance from the white line. Of course, most military activities do some portion of both. For example, development of new tank technologies helps move the front line forward, as well as kill more enemy soldiers. However, the key thing is that some activities fall more heavily into one category than the other, and attacking cities is as far down the cost side of the spectrum as it gets. To be clear, Russia is not only targeting civilians with its drones. There are military targets too. We just tend not to hear about those as much. One, because Ukraine does not want to give away free damage assessments, and two, because the civilian assaults look worse for the Kremlin on the international stage, and Ukraine needs international support to win this war. But that does not change the fact that there are still a lot of civilian strikes, and we should analyze what that means for what we do not see. Here is the dilemma for the Kremlin. Infinite funds are not available for the war effort. You can see this with the struggles that the Russian economy has gone through. Labor shortages, high inflation, bank runs, high interest rates, it goes on. Let's hold fixed the set of rubles that the Kremlin has available for the war effort. Well, following our conversation from the last section, it can dump that money into imposing costs on Ukraine, or it can shift the expected outcome of the war in its favor. In practice, of course, it is a bit of both for the Kremlin. As analysts, though, we do not directly observe what the allocations are. We can only see some of the consequences of the decision, like Russia's targeting of civilians. Now, using that power of observation, we can make some educated guesses as to where exactly Russia is allocating its funds. So perhaps Russia's division of its expenditures is something like this. The specifics are not important, just that there is a significant lump on the cost imposition side. With that, we can now start drawing a critical inference. Russia's allocation problem is to take X rubles and divide them between the two military strategies. The more that Russia invests in imposing costs, the more the costs that Ukraine suffers. The more that Russia invests in outright military power, the more it expects to win by fighting, which again also shifts the yellow line. Usually there are diminishing marginal returns to investing in either, so ultimately Russia's optimal strategy is some mix between the two. And with my apologies for adding some math here, let's actually call this cash quantity X, the cost imposed on Ukraine C, which is a function of the amount of rubles spent there, and Russia's expected share S, which is also a function of the rubles spent, but is equivalently the remainder of the rubles not spent on imposing costs. The Kremlin wants to maximize a sum of these two, which, on the map that we love so much, pushes the yellow line to the west as far as possible. Now, I am being somewhat loose here, because there are other reasons why Russia benefits more from maximizing its expected share. For example, if the parties never reach a ceasefire for whatever reason. But let's ignore that for today, because it complicates what comes next without altering our end conclusion. The key is that Russia gets positive returns on investing in each function, but great initial returns do not last forever. Thus, as you increase effort in each one of those choices, eventually you reach a wall where the returns are small. Hence, in practice, we observe a mix between the two strategies. The problem, again, for us keyboard warriors is that we do not observe what these functions actually look like. Policymakers, on the other hand, do understand what these functions look like. It is literally central to military planning. So their calculations are not nearly as opaque as some abstract functions. Life is therefore comparatively easy for them, and they do not need to do the same type of abstract mathematics that we will engage in shortly. And even with difficult mathematics, the lack of transparency means that I cannot tell you what Russia's precise allocation should be in practice. I can, however, tell you something important about how Ukraine internalizes the costs imposed. Whenever I draw this line, you will remember that I say something to the effect of, "This is how Ukraine internalizes the costs of war relative to how much it values the stakes." And you see the emphasized word there, relative. Literally, the way that this gets calculated is by taking the costs that Ukraine suffers and dividing them by how much Ukraine values the issue at stake, which we sometimes describe as how resolved it is. You can see how this works by thinking about the extremes. If I value the issues at stake to be worth, say, a penny, that amplifies how I internalize the costs. I am unwilling to defend the stakes in question because I do not care about them, and I am inflating the perceived cost accordingly. In contrast, if I view the stakes to be worth trillions of dollars, I am dividing those costs by a large number, and thus I am barely internalizing them. Understandably, Ukraine's bargaining position is a lot worse in this case than it is in this case. If you have ever wondered why the United States failed to defeat North Vietnam, this is a big part of the explanation. Hanoi was simply more resolved on the issues than Washington was. Back to today. I still do not know what these functions exactly look like, but the fact that costs are internalized by Ukraine's value of the stakes can tell us something. The key thing that we know is that V is large. Very large. After all, the war is a battle for Ukraine as a sovereign state, and so Ukraine values the stakes a great deal. There is a fair bit of irony here because part of the reason why the war began in the first place is that the Kremlin had vastly underestimated Ukrainian resolve. But however we got here, no matter what these functions look like, I do know that the optimal allocation for Russia directs fewer funds for cost and position as Ukraine's valuation increases. For us nerds out there, my ability to say this is thanks to the magic of the implicit function theorem, which allows you to sign derivatives of solutions to implicit functions, even without actual functions to work with. To recap, there are people in the Kremlin working through this trade-off. They spend time thinking about the coercive returns to winning on the battlefield versus damaging Ukraine, even if, again, they aren't using mathematical functions like we do. But no matter how exactly these trade-offs work in practice, even if you and I have no real idea what they look like, we can still know that increasing Ukraine's resolve encourages more Russian investment in actual battlefield results. Moreover, you should have an intuitive understanding why this is true, even if you do not care at all about a so-called implicit function theorem. Remember, Russia wants to make the total output of the sum as large as possible. When V is large, there just are not good returns on investments to inflating Ukraine's cost. As a result, Russia wants to put more effort into the battlefield situation, and thus we get the aforementioned overall relationship. Okay, now the real detective work begins. We know that Ukraine has a high valuation for the stakes. We also know that Russia is investing quite a bit in counter-value operations. Well, given the first bit, there are only two ways that make sense. One is that the amount of damage that Russia can deal by investing in counter-value operations is so large that Ukraine's massive suffering overwhelms its valuation. But we are seeing the damage done, and it is not at that level. I personally would not want to travel to Kyiv at the moment, but the city is still functioning. That leaves one other explanation, that Russia has a poor return on investment for trying to shift the expected outcome. Unfortunately, we do not have a great way to verify that this is the case, because frontline battle strategies can take months or even years to pay off. That said, a few observations are consistent with this. 1. Russia's pace along the east remains slow, despite the Kremlin ostensibly having planned a summer offensive following its winter lull. July is looking slower as well, and Russia could still take years to take the 4 claimed oblasts at this pace. 2. We have all heard the rumors of Russia having trouble meeting its recruitment goals, and increasing signing offerings to exorbitant levels to meet the quotas. Then, once the troops get to the front lines, a good portion of them either lose a limb or come home in a body bag. That connects to the third point. While announcing the US-Europe arms agreement, NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte also claimed that Russia had suffered 100,000 fatalities since January 1st. Not casualties, fatalities. I found it interesting how that received almost no attention from the news. Sure, the weapons transfers may have been the bigger story for the day, but 100,000 is an incredible number with long-term implications. Just go back and look at the territorial transfers since the start of the year. That works out to being roughly 44 dead per square kilometer. And yes, that comes with the caveat of the West having an incentive to inflate the figures. But that number would have to be massively misrepresented before it starts sounding like a good deal for Russia. Now, you might be tempted to say that the Kremlin does not care about the lives of its soldiers, but that is not true. Even if you view Putin as a strict utilitarian, those disabled veterans eventually become wards of the state. Those that die will not return home to be productive contributors to the tax base. And when your fertility rate is awful, all of that is a pathway to having a completely dysfunctional country over the long term. Consequently, one way to think about the Kremlin's trade-off is as follows. You have a bag of money for the war effort. Option 1 is that you put it toward the front line, shelling out a premium for recruitment, and paying an implicit long-term cost as well. Option 2 is that you use it to pay for some new factories to produce drones and hire a bunch of citizens to operate it at a lower cost. Then you yeet the drones at Ukrainian cities and hope for the best. The spray and pray of the 21st century. Well, we are seeing a lot of the latter option. And given that Russia hoping for the best here is a bit of a dream given Ukrainian resolve, that tells you quite a bit about how poorly the Kremlin views the first option. I recognize that there is a bit of a trope here, that countries only engage in these types of bombing campaigns when they cannot do anything on the ground, and thus even going down this route is an inherent sign of weakness. You could point to the Battle of Britain during World War II as an example of this, where Nazi Germany had practically no ability to cross the channel, so its planes just took to the air instead. That is not what I'm saying. The math explicitly shows that bombing campaigns can be successful. It just requires that the target not care much about the issues at stake. Ironically, that means that Ukraine would be comparatively better off engaging in that kind of activity. But hey, maybe Trump will be sponsoring that soon enough. Let's finish with one final thought about how this fits in with the news that the United States briefly halted shipments of various goods to Ukraine, including Patriots. You might remember that Patriots would be good for things like protecting Ukrainian cities. Well, given what we just worked through, this is not where Ukraine faces coercive vulnerability. So, again, any limitations there would be bad for Ukraine, but simultaneously they would not be backbreaking. And maybe that speaks to the political thinking from the Pentagon on the decision in the first place. There is some ambiguity here, but it seems that Undersecretary for Policy Bridge Colby made the call, with unclear direction from the White House itself. There also seemed to be a collective shock online that the Pentagon would do such a thing, but anyone watching this channel for the last year at this point would know that Colby only cares about China. So if I had to guess why this is happening, well, this is why that all happened. Trump reversed the decision, but direct U.S. aid still seemed to be sunsetting. The derivative here therefore still appears negative, just not as negative as what Colby had planned. Now, whether Europe will more than make up for the difference remains unclear. That all depends on how much U.S. partners want to throw at the problem. But remember that Europe is still protecting a point of relatively low vulnerability for Ukraine, so ultimately that does not matter as much as it may seem. Either way, it also does not solve the Pentagon's underlying concern, that its stockpiles dwindled too much following the 12-day war between Israel and Iran. Money just cushions the blow. It is not a long-term solution. Regardless, the materiel that supporters of Ukraine should pay more attention to is something like HIMARS deliveries and 155mm artillery shells. Unlike Ukraine's ability to absorb the damage to its cities, the country cannot do the same for movements on the front lines. Those are losses that eventually do accumulate, and will have a much larger impact on whatever the war's final settlement is. And stopping that is what those sorts of weapons are good for. Thus, losses on that front are the biggest threats to Ukraine's war effort. Once more, Patriots were the focus of the conversation when Trump and Rutte announced the agreement. It was an unavoidable topic because that was the thing that the news had focused on for the last week. However, the agreement itself does not have any limits on the weapons included, even as the pair of leaders were circumspect on the details. One reason to not go into the details is to not telegraph Ukraine's next move to the Kremlin. So something like a 155mm focus may actually be happening. We just would not know about it yet. Thanks again to Ground News for sponsoring today's video. Go to ground.news/linesonmaps or scan the QR code to take a 40% discount on a Vantage plan. And if you enjoyed today's video, please like, share, and subscribe, and I will see you next time. Take care.